a journey with Peter and his call as one of the first of Jesus' 12 disciples. And we learned that he was impulsive and impetuous, but even more so, passionate and committed and bold, even if his boldness wasn't always well thought out, as today's story proves. But first, so chapter 14 begins with the news that John the Baptist had been beheaded by Herod because it's what his daughter wanted for her birthday. It's what his daughter wanted for her birthday. John the Baptist's head on a platter. Now, if anybody of your daughters asks you for something you think is a little extreme, a little too expensive, it's not. But Jesus was devastated by this news and got into a boat with the intention of going off by himself to a deserted place. But before he even got there, the crowds heard that he was coming, and the crowds were growing larger by the minute, waiting on the shore for him. And by the time he landed, there were thousands of people in search of hope and healing. He really needed a break. He really deserved a break. But he had compassion on them. And a little later, the disciples arrived and saw all the chaos and gave it a couple of hours, but then suggested that Jesus dismiss the crowd so they could go get something to eat, and perhaps so that Jesus could finally get his long-delayed break. But instead, Jesus told the disciples, "You feed them." And here's this familiar story you already know. I'm sure they brought him everything they could find, which was only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, which he then blessed and broke into pieces and sent it around into the crowd. And at the end, when it all was gathered up, they had 12 basketfuls left that made their way back to Jesus. And about 5,000 men plus women and children had eaten that day. That day that Jesus, all he really wanted was a break. That's the point at which Jesus sent the disciples off to the other side of the Sea of Galilee while he finished up with the crowd. And then finally, he could go up the side of a mountain to be alone and pray. Even Jesus needed a break from the stress and heart-heavy work of compassion. You deserve one too, by the way. So when evening came, Jesus decided to rejoin the disciples. They were already out pretty far. And I wondered, so how big is the Sea of Galilee? Did you know it's the largest freshwater source in Israel? It's about as wide as the Salton Sea, which is much longer and definitely not fresh water. Or you think about it, it's the distance between here and La Mesa, roughly, which doesn't seem that far when you're in a car on a freeway, or it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But think about that distance in a boat, fighting against fierce winds and violent waves. And imagine, it was so difficult sailing into the wind that Jesus caught up with them by walking. So the disciples had had a similar experience in a boat a few chapters earlier in chapter 8. Jesus was in the boat with them as they were crossing when a fierce storm came up, waves so big they were filling the boat, and Jesus just slept right through it. He was only awakened by terrified disciples begging him, "Rescue us." And he said, "Why are you afraid, faint hearts?" Why? I mean, a freaking storm is about to drown them. That's why they're afraid. But this time, he's not in the boat with them. He's outside of it, walking toward them, which of course freaked them out. But when the whole "it's a ghost" thing was resolved, Peter, true to his impulsive and impetuous personal style, asked to join Jesus on the water. But actually he said, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water," I guess so that if he failed, it wouldn't be his fault. And with the fierce storm still raging, It's still raging, and Peter steps out of the boat and began walking to Jesus, but then notices the fierce, violent storm is still raging and began to sink, and he called out, "Rescue me," just like the disciples had in a boat earlier, and Jesus immediately grabbed out to him. Now, the Message translates Jesus' response as a sympathetic, "Faint heart, what got into you?" which I much prefer, that faint heart, over the Common English Bible, which translates the words as an accusation that Peter had weak faith. "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to doubt?" I don't think that's how Jesus would have spoken. Or maybe you're more familiar with the slightly more sympathetic, "O ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" But Peter doesn't suffer from either a weak or a little faith. I mean, yeah, he might be misguided at times and a little overzealous perhaps, but if we can describe anyone in this way, he was a man of wholehearted faith. He was an "I'm all in, no holding back, emotions on the sleeve" kind of faith, crying out, just crying one minute and rolling around on the floor laughing the next. Weakness wasn't his problem. And I wouldn't apply weak faith to us either. Mainline Christians might not have a weak faith, perhaps, as much as we might describe it sometimes as a timid faith. A struggle not with doubt. We know that doubt is part of the faith life. It's not the opposite of faith, but then what is? And there's lots of answers, but I want to suggest today that the opposite of faith is doing nothing, or trying nothing, or standing up for nothing. That's the opposite of faith. Now, Peter may have been impulsive and impetuous. He may break promises and act without thinking, kind of think about a bull in a china shop, but at least he didn't look in through the window of the china shop, just peek in. He got all in. His faith was not weak, and I thank God that Peter, full of enthusiasm, rushed right in. However, I also thank God that there are those who act boldly with great faith in thoughtful and deliberative ways too, who are prepared to do something, to try something and stand up for something. Do you know the story of Diane Nash? So in the summer of 1961, she was teaching workshops for freedom riders with her husband, Reverend James Bevel. She was 23, and 5 of her students were under 21 years old. She was arrested and charged with contributing to the delinquency of minors for encouraging them to break the law to desegregate interstate buses. She was found guilty of 5 counts, each carrying a sentence of 6 months, and so a combined total sentence of 2.5 years. She appealed, and the NAACP sent a $2,500 bond, the equivalent of almost $26,000 today, but the appeals court deliberately didn't inform her of her court date. And so because she didn't appear, now there's a warrant out for her arrest. And that warrant was quite a dilemma. She could avoid it completely by simply leaving the state, as the state hoped she would, but abandon the work she felt passionately called to do. Or she could go to jail. She and her husband had planned to spend their entire lives in Mississippi working for the liberation of black people. And she said, "I didn't want Mississippi white men or anyone else deciding for me where we could live and work. I didn't want anybody to run me anywhere I didn't want to go." But here's what was more complicated, or really much, much more complicated. She was 6 months pregnant, which would mean her child would be born in jail, and she would miss the first 2 years of his life. It wasn't a decision to jump into, so she retreated to her bedroom for 3 days. She told Bevel she didn't want to be disturbed for any reason by anyone. She said, I did nothing but eat, sleep, think, and pray. And after 3 days, I made the decision to surrender and serve the term. With intense meditation, I had tapped into a very powerful spiritual force that I can't fully explain. I thought over every eventuality and was prepared to face anything. I knew I could handle it. There was really nothing anybody could do to hurt me. So I came to a place of strength and peace that if they killed me, I was ready. Bevel was supportive, but faced a lot of criticism. Oh, Reverend Bevel, you shouldn't make your wife do that. That's too much. They only thought of me as the Reverend's wife, and as a woman incapable of making a decision like that on my own. So she presented herself to the sheriff, ready to serve her sentence, and he was clearly amused at the sight of her bulging midsection and told her to appear to Judge Moore's court, the same Judge Moore who found Byron de la Becque not guilty of killing Medgar Evers with a gun Judge Moore kept hidden in his house. Diane entered his court but wasn't going to sit in the colored section, so she walked right down to the front, and for the protest of sitting in the front row of her own trial, she was charged with defiance of local segregation laws and sentenced to jail for 10 days, which she immediately began to serve. And the jail offered her no accommodation for her clearly advanced pregnancy. No vitamin pills allowed, no change of clothes, no toothbrush allowed. She was kept isolated from the other prisoners so as not to corrupt them with her talk of civil rights. Only one guard was willing to engage her in conversation, and one day seemed genuinely interested when Diane explained the discrepancy in public school funding. For example, in Holly Bluff, they spent $191.77 per white child. And for every black child, they spent $1.26. But the worst of her experience, she said, was the cockroaches. Masses of them crawling up the walls at night, the clicking of their feet, and then falling from the ceiling right over her concrete slab of a bed. But at the end of those 10 days, she appeared before Judge Moore, and he proclaimed her sentence was complete and she was free to go. And she asked, aren't you going to hear the case of my contributing to the delinquency of minors? He said no. She told the judge very clearly she's going to go right back out to teach young people how to do nonviolent civil disobedience. She told him her full home address for the court records so they couldn't say she was hiding from them. I want you to know I'm not hiding from you. But the Mississippi authorities, well, they had tapped their home phone. And so they were very aware already that every civil rights organization in the nation knew her case and decided keeping her in jail was a public relations liability. So Diane said, I came away from that whole experience with a very much spiritually strengthened. For in jail I learned I could live with very little. The oppressive authorities imprisoned me and withheld basic necessities to frighten and control me. But it backfired because they're the ones who got scared. And in the end, I was freer, more determined and stronger than ever. And today, Diane is 85 years old and living in Chicago, and last year was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Sorry, I forgot the title. So both Peter and Diane had what I call a wholehearted faith. They put themselves all in. Where Peter may have been impulsive and Diane was more deliberate, both acted deeply and honestly to fulfill Jesus' call to come follow me and love our neighbors as completely as we possibly can. And next week, we'll continue to watch Peter succeed and fail to do just that. A reassuring example of our own attempts to not act timidly in the face of need, but for ourselves to act with a faith that is wholehearted. Now, what would that mean for you today? To live with your whole heart.